It's an honor and pleasure to be here with Dr. Rachel Rubinstein, who is a professor of American literature and Jewish studies. Thanks for taking time to talk today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. Me too. So to start with our topic of Jews and race, which is a huge issue, we'll start with a really big question, historical question. Have Jews always been associated with whiteness in America?
Okay, great question. And the short answer is no. And the history is complicated. So the way I usually start talking about whiteness with students is it's important to make a distinction between whiteness in the legal sense and whiteness in the social sense. So in 1790, the brand new Congress of the United States passed a naturalization law that said only free persons who are white can become citizens of the United States. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, whiteness has to be constantly legislated. Right? So policed, legislated, because it's tied to citizenship. So people of African descent, of course, were not white, could not become naturalized citizens. That included slaves. People who from Asia, people from, were not white. But then there were populations where it was not as clear. So people from the Middle East, from North Africa, from Southern Europe, their racial status was unclear. Mm-hmm. So there are all sorts of Supreme Court cases in the United States where immigrants basically petition they get all the way to the Supreme Court and basically are trying to get categorized as white so that they can become citizens of the United States. So for instance, Arab Americans, Middle Eastern immigrants, there's Supreme Court cases, immigrants from Syria petitioning to be considered white, an immigrant from Japan petitioning to be considered white, and the Supreme Court is all over the place. Yeah. So there could be two cases a year apart. In one case, the Supreme Court decides that this immigrant from Syria is white, and in another, they decide that this immigrant from Egypt is not white, right? So
based on what kind of criteria? Yeah.
It's complicated. So whiteness is something, it's obviously extremely unstable in the United States, and the way, this is a very long conversation, but even the way we sort of talk about race on the U.S. Census, right? How the U.S. has racial categories on the U.S. Census, they keep changing. So that's whiteness in the legal sense, right? Yeah. But whiteness in the social sense, so Jews, from the beginning, there was never really, their whiteness was never challenged in a legal sense. They were always eligible for naturalized citizenship status, right? So they were considered white in a legal sense. But in a social sense, not as much. Yeah. So, so for instance, and this is really tied to class, right? This is tied to, once Jews are a really large immigrant population, because until the 1880s, Jews were a tiny, tiny fraction of the Jewish population, of the population of the United States, very, very small. The first wave of Jewish immigration was Sephardic, usually from, the sort of Jews of Spanish and Portuguese descent who had moved to, say, Amsterdam and then to England, make their way to the United States. So this is kind of the Sephardic immigration. They tended to be very educated and merchants and well off. And so, their citizenship their eligibility for citizenship wasn't challenged, but their racial status is actually very complicated, which I can kind of get back to. But and then the next wave of Jewish immigration to the States is, mid-19th century, mostly German, also middle class, merchants. They go west, they become the, merchants of Main Street. Their racial status is also not so challenged because it's a tiny, tiny population. But then once masses of immigrants start coming from Eastern Europe and they speak Yiddish and many of them are religious or radical, and they're not educated, and they're coming over in huge numbers. That's when racial panic sets in the social sense in the United States. And so Jews are definitely, a lot of scholars say that their racial status was off-white, not quite white, right? And that, and so Jewish immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Southern European immigrants, so Greece, Italy, Slavic immigrants, all of these are kind of the unwanted, this kind of sets off this racial panic, this anti-immigration hysteria of the turn of the century, and that culminates in this 1924 definitive Anti-Immigration Act. Right. The usual narrative of Jews becoming white in America, usually the narrative goes, post-1945, when anti-Semitism becomes really unfashionable and Jews enter the middle class and, they kind of become white. And there's books about this, how the Jews became white folks and what that says about race in America. The Price of Whiteness by a historian named Eric Goldstein, it's a good book. but the complexity of that narrative is, first of all, there are many Jews who were not descended from Eastern European, who were not European.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And then, so there's that. So what do you do
I
about
saw
this
stats
category?
recently, it's as low as 10%, and maybe as high as even 30% of Jews in America.
Right,
It's a
are
huge
not
rate.
necessarily. I
Yeah.
mean, the
Jews
majority
of color,
probably
yeah.
are,
Yeah,
from
yeah.
Eastern European. That's the majority of
Well,
Jews. But there, so it kind of it masks the actual racial diversity of
Yeah.
Jews in America and all over the world.
Yeah.
Also, the complexity of this is that when Jews entered the United States, they weren't categorized. Jewish was not a category, sort of in the immigration records. So you were categorized by your nation of origin. So it's really hard actually to trace Jewish immigration that way, because Jews weren't labeled Jews when they entered the country. They were Polish, or they were Russian, or they were Hungarian, or they were, whatever.
Yeah.
Polish. And so, did I say Polish? I probably said Polish.
Yeah.
So anyway, so what that means is that there were tons of Jewish immigrants from the Ottoman Empire, right? From Turkey, from Syria, from North Africa, that looked probably pretty Middle Eastern, right? But they would not have been characterized as Jewish. They would have been characterized as from the Ottoman Empire. So, it kind of, this narrative, the Jews became white folks, definitely masks the reality of a huge racial diversity in the United States. And it also has the function, I think, of shutting down a lot of conversation. It's like Jews have become white folks, and that's, as if...
Right.
And what we're seeing now, I think we're seeing a lot of a resurgence of white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and are Jews really white in the United States? What does that mean?
Right.
And there's lots of wonderful scholars actually who do a lot of really fascinating work on Jews in the Caribbean and Jews in Latin America, where there was a lot of mixing of populations, and so there are a lot of Jews of color. From those geographical locations.
Hey,
So it's
how pervasive do you think the notion among minorities that Jews are potentially involved in something quite deceptive, by both kind of claiming to be minorities who are oppressed similar to Latino or African Americans, and yet having the socioeconomic status, the power and privilege of the white establishment, being able to kind of play both cards? Is your sense that that's kind of an ongoing perception?
I mean, I think that's definitely a narrative that's out there, which is, Jews, there is a very real history of genocide and oppression. On the other hand, Jews have been able to claim the benefits and privileges of whiteness.
Yeah.
Again, that sort of assumes that all Jews have the same, you know what I mean? Like that all Jews have that opportunity to claim whiteness when, so again, like it sort of masks the actual diversity of Jewish identity and Jewish kind of skin color. But there is something to be said for that, this idea that, you can talk that talk of sort of like identifying or sympathizing with the oppressed, but like you're not living that oppression. On the other hand, what is it about Jews that they still want to, claim identification or sympathy or affiliation or get involved in liberation movements of other peoples? Why is it they don't have to do that, right? So if the narrative is true that Jews have become white in the U.S., then why do so many Jews still insist on sort of advocating for the liberation or for the rights of other people? So what is that about? Not a lot of groups do that.
Right. Fascinating. So where would you say, I mean, this is another huge question that could last us for weeks, but where would you say Black-Jewish relations are today? I think that a lot of Jews I talk to point to this Rabbi Heschel MLK picture and be like, oh, we're like best friends because we have this picture that shows that our rabbis were marching for civil rights in the 60s. And my sense is that actually we're not as in deep a relationship as some imagine we are, but I wonder, how you understand that landscape today.
I think it's a complicated, we're in a complicated place, right? And I think there is a kind of Jewish romance with the Jews' role in civil rights, and I think for sure Jews were involved in a kind of outsized proportion in the fight for civil rights. But again, does that you know, I think that there are tremendous points of conflict that maybe there's a way to work through them, but maybe there are certain irreconcilable, right, politics there. I think that, you know, most scholars will talk about sort of like, you know, the usual narrative of Black-Jewish relations is that, you know, Jews and Blacks kind of had this sort of harmonious, you know, Jews involved in the NAACP and Jews involved in civil rights and, you know, all sorts of kind of like Jewish, Black sort of fruitful interaction that starts to kind of fall apart in the era of, you know, when civil rights kind of moves into sort of more militant kind of Black power. That's when the relationship starts to fray, and then the Crown Heights riots are usually often talked about as kind of that moment, that sort of like Black-Jewish relations, kind of that was the break.
Right.
But I think that the relationship between, again, like Jewish immigrants and their descendants and enslaved people from Africa and their descendants, right, has always been really complicated in the U.S. And of course, this is also assuming that Blacks can't be Jews and Jews can't be Black, right? Because that's also not true, right? So, but I think it's always been really complicated, and I think that I definitely, like, I live in a place where there are so many Jews who have involved themselves in Black Lives Matter and who have involved themselves in sort of in protests against kind of all this anti-immigration rhetoric, and you know, so I think Jews are sort of, they want to be allies. I think that, like all white people, they have to figure out how to do that in a way that's, you know, not,
so what do you see as
not patronizing, not white savior, not, you know. So
what do you see as like one of the primary points of tension, and what do you see as kind of the one of the more successful models of collaboration?
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously Israel is a point of tension, you know. So, and that's.
And why would African Americans feel so passionately about such an issue?
Well, I think this was an alliance that really cohered in the late '60s with Black Power, and I think you know, this idea that all people of color fighting for liberation are all in solidarity with each other, and so the narrative of Palestinians as an occupied people fighting for people of color fighting for liberation, and that people of color in the U.S. you know, that's their fight too, right? So this kind of narrative of identification with Palestinians was extremely powerful.
And Mandela was a part of that kind of bridge,
Yeah, so that's an extremely powerful narrative, and so I think that has really. You know, that's become a really powerful narrative on the left, is all people of color are in solidarity and Palestinians are in occupied people of color. I think, you know, I'm going to talk about James Baldwin a little bit later today. James Baldwin is really interesting, the way in which he kind of addresses anti-Semitism amongst African Americans, and kind of trying to, you know, why. He says it's understandable why Blacks would be anti-Semitic because it's part of being anti-white. But this is also the way anti-Semitism works. It's that the people, it distracts the people on the bottom from really rebelling against the people with true power. So Jews become this kind of vulnerable scapegoat where oppressed people are kind of are sort of manipulated into redirecting their anger against Jews, because that way they're not going to really be angry at the people who are really in power, which are, you know, not Jews, right? So, so there's a way in which, so that's why kind of this tension between Blacks and Jews, or Jews and people of color, and what is the role of Jews in sort of the fight for equal rights, and it gets complicated by anti-Semitism, because that's how anti-Semitism works, right? It says to people of color, the source of your problems are the Jews. You know, so that's what's hard.
Okay, so my last question for you is, in these polarized times, how do you imagine sort of the future of what this goes? Not in a prophetic sense, but, you know, I mean, what do you see this relationship looking like in a decade from now? I mean, while Jews in America are dealing with their own sort of reemergence of anti-Semitism and trying to fight to keep ourselves in that allyship where it's complicated, what do you see as kind of the future of this relationship?
I have a colleague who's a historian who says, you know, historians can't tell the future. So, you know, I deal with history. I don't know about the future. I think, there are two narratives, I think, that American Jews tell about themselves. And I think that the future is going to depend on which narrative we want to embrace. So the two narratives, one narrative is Jews were an oppressed people, right? They come to America, and through hard work, we pull ourselves up from our bootstraps and we are successful, right? Like, we're successful immigrants because we're smart and we work hard, right? And so we did it the right way, right? Because of our talent and our internal resources as a community. And that's one narrative. What that narrative produces is not a lot of sympathy for others, right? So you can imagine that narrative kind of coming to mean, well, we don't have a lot of sympathy for undocumented immigrants because, like, we're immigrants too, but we came here the right way. And
which is not historically true also.
Right.
Forged passports.
But yeah, well, this idea of undocumented is also a modern invention, right? There was never,
yes.
So, yes, there were many, many undocumented Jewish immigrants.
And today, actually, Israelis in America.
Yeah.
I read over 100,000 undocumented Israelis in America. So anyways.
There are many, right. So, of course. So, but that's a narrative that can produce a lot of, like, we are, Jews are exceptional, and that means that we don't actually, have to be involved in other people's fights because, right, this kind of like Jewish exceptionalism. So that's one narrative. So to what extent are Jews in America going to embrace that narrative? And the other narrative is, Jews in America, in the U.S., have benefited from structures and systems that allowed us to social, class, racial mobility to a degree unprecedented, right? And what do we do with that privilege, right? Like, what are we going to do with that? And isn't it the responsibility and mission of Jews then to change those systems and structures, or so it depends on what narrative you embrace about yourself.
One of the things that stirs up for me is that it feels like a gift we have in that we have a historical consciousness of being an outsider, and yet in many ways we have the power and privilege of being insiders, and to use that as an opportunity, as you just said. To leverage that for other minorities as well.
Yeah.
So
there's a joke about that.
Yeah.
Jews who are like insiders and outsiders, like what other people would invent the bagel, which only has an outside.
Right.
Right?
That's amazing. Okay, thanks so much. Amazing. Keep up your